So far, sanctions against Russia include the exclusion from SWIFT, making it impossible for sanctioned Russian banks to pay for and receive goods from abroad. There are also restrictions on major banks with immediate consequences. The European subsidiary of Russia's state-owned Sberbank is facing bankruptcy. Last week's initial sanctions also included asset freezes and travel bans for individuals, as well as the blocking of Russia's access to semiconductors, computers and other high-tech products. Experts consider the sanctions against Russia harsh and expect them to possibly cripple the Russian economy for years to come.
Joining me now in the studio is DW correspondent Clifford Coonan. Clifford, let's talk about the implication these sanctions are having. The ruble is plummeting, first of all. What does that mean for the Russian economy?
Well, it's a disaster in many ways. The pictures we've just seen of these queues outside banks tell us so much. If you imagine that you're a Russian saver, an ordinary Russian who's got all their savings in rubles, they're worth 30% less today than they were yesterday. It's 119 rubles to the dollar now. So in that case, it's a very, very serious problem. And, you know, often when we're talking about, you know, the political and the economic where they overlap, I think it's always with sort of things like currency values that you really see the political impact, the possible political impact of this because it's so strong. Prices will rise because it will force inflation, because a lot of the economy relies on imports, which will now cost more because the ruble is worth less. So in these areas, you can sort of see that it's going to have massive impact.
The sanctions on the Russian central bank, is that sort of the sharpest weapon that has been employed?
It is. I mean, there's been quite a lot of discussion about the SWIFT transfer payments system being a strong weapon, but actually in many ways the limitation and the restrictions on the European Central Bank are even tougher, because what it means is that Russia has something like 630 billion in foreign reserves, which in the run-up to the invasion was sort of seen as the war chest that Putin would use for this. But around 40% of those are held overseas. And if they can't access 40% of their reserves, that puts them into a difficult position. So the restrictions on the central banks have been a very important weapon.
Another important weapon is, of course, the exclusion from this SWIFT banking payment and information system that's used globally. In which way does that affect the Russian economy?
Yeah, well, I think the SWIFT system is kind of like a WhatsApp where banks talk to each other on a social. It's a communications tool, essentially. So while in many ways it isn't as sharp a weapon as the the Russian central bank sanctions, it's still a very important one because banks can't talk to each other, which means you can't do clearing. You have to use alternative systems, and that takes time and it costs money. And some people have estimated it could cost maybe 20% more in terms of transaction costs. So it's also something that will completely isolate the Russian banking system, because so many countries are now sanctioning the Russian banking system that nobody's going to really bother putting in an alternative system of payment.
Thank you, Christy. So, Ian, also we do have a short PowerPoint from Ian. So, Christy, can you put that up, and then we go into that presentation.
All right, are we ready? Good afternoon. Yeah. Okay, great. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be, well, not necessarily discussing this particular topic, but a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Before I start, I just want to say this situation is very fast moving. It's rapidly evolving, and so I want to caveat that everything that I say here should not be taken as carved in stone. I did this PowerPoint because I wanted, the audience to have some tangible elements of the presentation, so to be able to view. So with that said, here we go into the first slide. Right. So starting off with something slightly unusual here. Ben Carson is a portfolio manager, and he wrote a piece on March 1st titled "Predicting the Future is Hard." And at the beginning of this year, I myself, in my Thursday Business Guardian column, wrote on a similar theme. And basically what I said back then is that we should shy away from making predictions because we will most likely be wrong. What I have in front of you there is a letter that was written by Lynn Wells from the Pentagon, drafted to the then US President George W. Bush in April of 2001. And that was just before 9/11. And basically this one-page letter speaks to things that happened over various decades. But prior to it happening, we didn't expect it to happen. And so I'll just draw your attention to the last two bullets there, where it speaks about the situation in Europe and with NATO, and that was 2001. But it's really the next line. The next line that is very paradoxically instructive. I am not sure what 2010 will look like, but I am sure that it will be very little like we expect. So we should plan accordingly. Take that point and change the date. If you take nothing else away from this session, at least take that point. That predicting the future is hard, and it is even harder when things are evolving as quickly as this and with the scope and the scale that we are experiencing now. And so that brings me to the title of how I want to present this session to you today. Next slide, please. I would term this the Great Bifurcation. And before I go further, let me just say that my role here is to present an overview of the situation and to position that in a financial context. And then let me state up front that there is unlikely to be a direct finance sector impact to the Caribbean, but there will be a financial sector impact one way or the other. In some ways, that impact would be better expressed by the sections on the energy sector when we discuss supply chains, which will come later. So you stay tuned for that, and I will defer those types of comments to allow for the presentations to come. It's easier to think in teams, and that's why I have put forward this term, the Great Bifurcation. And if you're not familiar with the word bifurcation means to cause to divide into two branches or parts. And I feel that that is where we are at this juncture. And so now let me explain what that means in a little bit more detail. Next slide. The entire global financial system is being upended like never before. You may have gotten a little sense of that from the video that was presented. And I'll give you two quotes. One is from the LA Times, and it says that global interdependence has been weaponized for geopolitical purposes. And then another quote from Bloomberg Businessweek, it's a couple of days ago, and it says that to punish Putin, the world turned finance into a weapon of war. You are seeing the word finance being used alongside the word weapon. And that is the highlight that I want to bring. Next slide. What we are witnessing now is how powerful the Western financial system really is and how it could be switched on and off. I mean, we had an experience in Canada a couple of weeks ago where citizens were shut off from the banking system based on a government mandate. And now we have a situation where an entire country, the 12th largest by GDP, is being shut off of the global financial system. And this is unprecedented. You see here, these two quotes from Bloomberg, right? That speaks to Russia's attempt to prepare for this type of event and the cost that they would have incurred implicitly in that type of preparation. And then having prepared for it in the way that they did was expecting that it would allow them to take them through the early stages of this situation. And it didn't work. And I think because it didn't work, that's where we now have the challenge that we're now facing. That is what makes all of this a little bit unprecedented. It started out with banking and SWIFT, as you have seen from the video, but then it has escalated and it's evolved. And I think it is Ian Bremmer who runs the Eurasia Group, which is a global risk and political think tank. And basically he said yesterday that this is the first time that he's experiencing a conflict for which the options only seem to be escalation rather than de-escalation. And that creates significant risks. And it creates, and so those risks, first of all, in order to understand it, we must step back and appreciate that controlling the financial system is one of the most powerful weapons of war right now. And if this continues for any length of time, as you saw in the video, the Russian economy is likely to collapse. But the next point to that is that nature abhors a vacuum. And so if finance has been weaponized, then those on the outside of that system will seek to find alternatives. And I mean, we experienced this right next door with our neighbor Venezuela, and how the use of sanctions there and how that eventually unfolded. But that scale doesn't compare to what is taken now. And so the big question is, can the existing sanctions hold? How long will it hold for? But the even bigger question then becomes, what about the level of distrust that comes across from both sides now, even if it would stop now? And that makes the path that we are on almost irreversible, because finance is ultimately based on trust. And that's why I use this term, the great bifurcation. Because to those within the system, the strength of the US dollar is a source of comfort. But to those outside of that system, it is a source of concern. Western inflows into Russia will grind to a halt. We see that, it's getting kind of obvious now. But that means two things. There will be dislocations to supplies coming out of Russia, which our other panelists will speak to. And there will be a new demand for capital inside of Russia. And where that capital comes from is where you have the possibility of the bifurcation taking place in terms of global finance and trade. That is still evolving. That is not yet, fully clear to us. But if you think, 6 months, 2 years down the road, and this thing continues on, then you get into a place where small countries like the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago, you either have to implicitly or explicitly choose a side. And that for countries such as ours is something that is also going to be discomforting. I mean, the best example I can give you in relation to how is that, you have a cricket association or a football association, and they're having a tournament, and a team gets kicked out of the tournament, and then that team that gets kicked out wants to forge alliances and create a breakaway tournament. And then what happens is, if you align yourself there, then you get banned from the main association. And that's where we are at right now. Can move on to the next slide, please. We are faced with a number of previously unexpected actions, each on its own may be manageable, but each one also produces a risk. The risk is now multiplicative, and so the combined effect of all of this is the potential for a huge or a series of significant tail events. That is really the issue. There is no one at this point in time can sit down and say X is going to be happening, or Y is going to be happening. But what we have is a significant risk that you can see tail events taking place. And if you want to understand that better, you just need to think back to the 2008 financial crisis. And you saw how things that started off as insignificant eventually became, exactly what it was, a global financial crisis. Because you now have, for the first time, well, not for the first time, but you now have a country that is the 12th largest by GDP be shut out from the global financial system. And that is unprecedented in this interconnected type of world that we are in. And so it's not just about banking and SWIFT. It started out that way. But it has moved way beyond that. Next slide, please. And so if we have the exposure to tail risk now in a way that we probably did not have 2 weeks ago, then the question that you don't have to ask yourself is, what do you do, right? And when you are immersed in chaos, my point of view in terms of how we deal with risk, it is not prudent to proceed with complex and uncertain plans, because by the time you're finished with that plan, it's probably obsolete. And so we should, and so instead, the better approach is to see if there are any simple first steps where your goals are clear, can be undertaken, and can be accomplished with reasonable certainty, or at least with minimum fallout. If you are a supply chain manager, if you are in a bank and you're looking at risk, if you know, it is now time to dial back and see how things proceed and see how the dust settles. I would say to you that we are in a place where our choices, moment by moment, can make a difference to our outcomes. And so the key element here is not choices, but rather is moment by moment. And I will appreciate that operating moment by moment comes with a cost, because then you lose scale and you have to place redundancies in relation to things happening in the way that you didn't expect. But at this point in time, it is a necessary cost, in my view, in terms of how any one of you would want to manage your operations. And why am I saying this? Well, let me explain that further in the next slide. This thing has taken on a life of its own. I would refer to this as cancel culture on steroids. And that's not a judgment about who's right or wrong, or whether anything is right or wrong. I think I'm kind of phrasing it as a reality as it now stands. Because the Western world has, with one voice, taken a decision to cancel a country. Right? This has not happened in a post-World War II era. There was supposed to be a carve-out for oil, sanctions package, and things like that. But the financial institutions are pulling back. Even so, that the carve-outs, which are supposed to protect Western interests, are not there in reality. And so in effect, you are now seeing a huge degree of self-sanctioning as companies volunteer not to do business with Russia or Russian entities. And this is happening partly because of counterparty risk. Next slide. I'll give you an extract here from a Bloomberg article to kind of highlight the counterparty risk. Right? You have banks in Europe have stopped providing trade finance for Russian raw materials flows. And this is from a few days ago. And they're restricting lending deals because you're not sure what is happening on the other side. And if you're not sure if you could have delivery, you're not sure if you're going to have payment, then these things are happening voluntarily. It's happening because of the uncertainty, right? Self-sanctioning is taking place because of the extreme levels of counterparty risk that's now at play. And even if you try to unilaterally unwind, which is what has taken place when you had sanctions, then you still have both sides of a trade that's likely to be affected. Buffering that, really nobody has put forward anything to suggest how those things will be buffered, because we really don't know what is taking place as yet. Right? We are dealing with a level of global financial complexity here. And the key part of all of this is complexity that is funded by leverage in a significant way. And small cracks, when you're dealing with leverage, small cracks could cascade into big cracks. And then you have unintended consequences. I mean, I mentioned the global financial crisis a little bit earlier. If you were following it back then, this thing started in 2007, but it's called the global financial crisis of 2008. There were hedge funds that were blowing up in 12 months before, which just seemed to be, an item of news, not understanding all the intricacies and the movements that led to what then eventually came to the front pages in 2008, right? When you have oil majors exiting, banks pulling back, shipping lines stop shipping, aircraft stop flying, aircraft service providers stop servicing, you're going to have a huge dislocation to an economy that, and that's one part of it. But the other part of it then is the blowback effect. Because as I said at the start there, this is all interconnected and there are two sides to a trade. There's always two sides to a trade. That's a fundamental part of this presentation to take forward. Next slide. So let's speak to some of the specifics that we need to contend with from a financial perspective. All right, there are 4 financial issues that if you are a financial risk manager, you would have to deal with in this situation. Again, let me repeat, as I started off, the first bullets you start off with, I would suggest that there will be little or no impact on the Caribbean region, but gradually as you move down, there is likely to be more and more of a potential impact. It is not likely to be direct. And could very well come from outside. The financial risk issues are, first of all, direct exposures one may have to Russia or Ukraine. I believe in later on some of the panelists will speak to some direct trade, if any exists, between Russia, Ukraine, and the Caribbean. That's one. Then you have direct exposures to regions that may be connected in some way with Russia, Ukraine, and the EU. And as you can see now that they started to expand that out a little bit, it starts to get a little bit fuzzy. And then those two things lead to the third problem. And the third risk factor is that there's going to be a macroeconomic fallout, which is going to be global in nature. And that is where it now starts to hit our shores. You might have an oil trade that may be an item 1. And then you may have a series of associated contracts that may be in item 2. But then how does all of this drill down into the economics of the oil market and pricing? And then that pricing flowing through the economy, and that flow through impacting inflation. And that inflation impacting central bank action. And that central bank action impacting foreign currency movements across borders, right? All of that is really what the next stage to come. And then you have the things that you're not going to see coming. And by nature of the fact that we don't see it coming, I really can't speak to anything specific here. But I give you an example just a short while ago of, you have a leveraged hedge fund that took a position in something that they did not expect to be impacted here. It could be wheat, it could be airlines. And then they need to unwind that, but there is no one to unwind it to. And that's what we really have to wrap our minds around in the coming days, weeks, and months. For what I can gather so far, since 2014, after the first wave of sanctions was imposed on Russia, most of the banks with exposure to Russia, and that's really the European banks we're talking about here, don't have significant group funding going into Russia. As a Caribbean region, we learned this lesson post-CLICO and when Barbados had their debt restructuring. If you operate in a banking group in different jurisdictions, you want the subsidiary allocation to be as much as possible self-funding. So loans within Russia being backed was, you try to get that backed by local Russian deposits and local Russian bonds, so that if the entities that they are nationalized as part of a retaliatory tit for tat, investment goes to zero. The risk is within Russia, contained within Russia, and that's already a problem for Russian investors as opposed to yours. That if banks were dimensioning their risk properly, then that is what you would expect to happen. But then you have the regions that are connected, and that's where the counterparty risk starts to kick in. And then you get to the macroeconomic fallout, and then it really starts to get uncertain. We would have had a situation, I think, a situation in the 1990s when we were raising rates into higher commodity prices. But I would suggest that the number of different commodities at play here, the elevated level of inflation that currently exists, I would suggest that the Fed, the US Federal Reserve, being behind the curve and maybe needing to catch up. All of those things, it was already going to be a difficult exercise that they were facing without this, in terms of how to dimension interest rates and inflation. With this, it is going to be even more difficult. Understand that banks are sensitive, extremely sensitive to interest rate changes, but right now we are guessing as to the size, the duration, the quantum. And then on top of that, you have the national issues to deal with in terms of a potential refugee crisis in some economies, impacts of commodity prices for most commodities going up. You will have ramp up in military spending, which will have budgetary impacts across a number of countries. Then you have the weaker emerging market countries, and this is going to be, you talk about canaries in coal mines. This is where is likely to see the first signs of cracks, right? Where you have weaker emerging market countries where there is political instability at government levels, and then you have high levels of debt. Those are the ones that are the highest risk at this time. And then from there, you are likely to see contagion effects if something goes wrong. And then if all of that is complicated enough, then you have the sub-team, the other plot of self-sanctioning, because that's already the macro team. Now you have the self-sanctioning that could take place, and that you could have a bank or an entity, any entity doing trading in something that's sanctioned. They don't need to do it on purpose, because this thing is now so wide and so broad, and you know, trading in something that is sanctioned and then getting fined or penalized for it. I mean, these things that happened before sanctions have been around for a long time, and so, you know, the bottom line in all of this is the financial plumbing of the world has been upended. Right, SWIFT correspondent banking payments in Russia, the Russian stock market is closed until next Tuesday at least. You have huge settlement and counterparty risks. And then you have the tit for tat that is likely to play off, where you have, you know, dollars being confiscated on one side and assets being confiscated on the side of Russia, to the extent that it is probable. Next slide. This is, you know, just to sum it up at the end, all I would say to you is settlement risk, margin calls, leverage in general can trigger outsized losses that are not apparent at a surface level. We need to be on the lookout for that. It's too early to tell how this plays out, but at the moment, one has to be extremely vigilant on the financial side. And I will end how I started, that it is not about our choices per se, but how we deal with things moment by moment that will see us through this until the dust settles and until we get a clearer picture of what is ahead of us. Thank you very much. That's my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much for that. I see Mariano has joined us. Could I ask the panelists to put on their cameras? I'd like to just explore some of the areas that that Ian went over, and just get some of the panelists' thoughts on. And of course, I know that when you look at Russian exports, energy makes up, I think, close to 50% of it. So I know when we get to Mariano, that's going to become a very heavy discussion, because we are seeing the price of energy across the world. But if I can ask Mariano first from a finance perspective. Mariano, I saw you. Come on, are you in?
I'm in.
Okay,
but
good.
I had to switch computers, I had to switch computers, and unfortunately, the video on this one isn't working. So you have my voice. I've also sent some slides to use, but I'll deal with that later. One of the slides is what you're going to directly related to the point that you're about to make. I don't know if I just took over from you, because you were asking me a question. So well,
I'm not going to hand over for the energy part yet, but for as it relates to the finance part. So I'm asking you, over to you, Mariano.
Yeah, and the point I would make about that Ian's presentation is perfectly on point. I accept that, except as one-way traffic. It operates from the presumption of what the West will do. And I guess we're taking it from the perspective that Russia has no armory or no tools that it can use. The point with regard to energy is a significant part of Russia's GDP formulation. It makes up approximately 9% of GDP, but an outside portion of its exports. And its exports are not only energy products, it also exports rare earth, it exports uranium and a number of other items which are used in the production of chips. And it also exports wheat. So it's a substantial part of the world market in that regard. It takes up about 10% of the energy market. But what most people have looked at so far is the effect of sanctions on Russia. Now, at the moment, Europe gets approximately 41% of its energy supplies, certainly its natural gas supplies, from Russia. And we all know, those of us who live in Trinidad, what happened 2 weeks ago when one of our plants shut down. And so far, there has been no disruption in energy supplies through Europe. Now, just what would take place if Russia were to return the favor and to turn off its gas and energy supplies to Europe? Not one European economy will be unaffected, and that includes Britain. So that means that literally, in the same way that you're looking at plummeting expectations taking place in terms of the Russian ruble and the Russian stock markets, every major economy in Europe, particularly Germany, which imports 50% of its energy requirements out of Russia, it means that would have a direct and immediate financial impact. It means people won't be able to go to work. If people are not going to go to work, then you're going to expect confidence in the stock exchange and everything else. You'll get civil disorder, right? And in the same way that we have had a decline in, or we had for one day, the country shut down. Just consider if they were to lose approximately 50% of their energy requirements in one day, or for that matter, for 1 week, and what impact that would have on the outlook for the economy, or the outlook on France, or the outlook on Italy, and so on. If you work it backwards, the same sort of doomsday scenario that Ian was pointing out with respect to what the West could, and the influence the West could have on Russia, well, they can have exactly the same effect on Europe. And by definition, if it affects Europe, it's going to affect all the major stock markets in the world. So this is not one-way traffic. Yeah. And so far, not one factory has closed in Europe, not one, how shall I put it? They haven't had any blackouts, they've had no brownouts, they've had no change. So in real terms, Russia has, to all intents and purposes, kept the energies flowing to Europe. The question would be, since we're talking about asymmetric warfare, meaning that the West has declared war on Russia, what if Russia were to do the same? And in terms of LNG exports, 3 countries account for over 70% of LNG exports to Europe. America is 26%, Russia is 24%, and Qatar is, I think, somewhere around Qatar. Yes, I think it is Qatar. One of the other Middle Eastern countries is approximately 20%.
It's Qatar. It is Qatar.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. That's 70%. But the same token, LNG only accounts for approximately 9% or 10% of total energy use in Europe. So this is not one-way traffic. And I think the point that Ian makes, that this is moment to moment by exercise, I think that's where we are. Because we don't know what the next step is going to be. And I think for us to assume that Russia is in a corner and it does not have any ammunition and it does not have any impact or doesn't have the capacity to impact Western financial markets is a little myopic, right? It doesn't, is myopic, right? Yeah. It can and have a significant impact on every Western economy, just simply because that's what we learned. And that's one of the things that the pandemic has put on the table, right? The fact that we, to a large extent, are integrated, right? Yes, Russia is integrated in the Western world and the West can hurt it, but Russia has the same capacity to hurt the Western world.
So the opposite is also true. Yeah, no point. No, good point.
If I may, Gabriel, just to stick a pin in there, the title of my presentation was The Great Bifurcation. And I
take the point.
Bifurcation means that you go off in 2 different paths. So it was never the one-way traffic is not consistent with a bifurcation. So let's just if that question.
I wasn't what you call it. I wasn't in any way attempting to undervalue the point that you make. In fact, I was making the point. In fact, I'm adding to your point by saying that the Western world so far and the Western press has paid attention to what they are doing to Russia. The reverse, nobody has stopped to think that Russia has the capacity. Russia has the capacity to cause more friction to more countries, right, with one action.
So Mariano, before we move on, I would like, if you don't mind, Mariano, because I want to come back to you to cover energy in more detail, but I'd also like to get some input from Dr. Hughes. The goal is that as we discuss a topic, I just want to circulate to the group just to zero in on some of the key points that the speaker made, So, Dr. Hughes, I don't know, I know you are talking about logistics and supply chain later, but are there, I mean, Mariano has captured it very well. Are there any other points on Ian's area, finance, that you would like to just contribute?
The one point I want to make at this stage is that this is the beginning. It's not the end of the beginning. It's not the middle of the beginning. It's just the beginning. And this is going to reverberate for a very, very long time. Because my personal view is that this is just almost the continuation of the old Cold War, where people felt that there were issues that were not resolved sufficiently. And here is one moment in history that we're going to solve all the problems. Unfortunately, the world has become far more complex, as has been explained, both in terms of finance, trade, globalization in general. Just take one example. Our biggest problem in Jamaica in relation to this war was just to get our students home out of Ukraine. That created enormous internal debate and discussion. But that's just the beginning of that problem, because education is going to be disrupted going forward. Lots of people were accessing tertiary education from Eastern Europe, well, former Eastern European countries, and now just European countries in general. I don't think that is going to be get back to normal soon.
Mr. Cummins, are you? Can you give us a brief perspective on the financial aspect?
Sure. Thank you very much.
Your thoughts.
And thank you guys for a very high level discussion so far. Great stuff. One thing I want to say that for the last week, what every institution should have been doing in the region, especially operating in international business, whether you're a bank or just a service provider, you would have been scrubbing your database of clients to make sure that they are nowhere in those sanctions lists, and scrubbing them against the UN list, against OFAC, etc. Because it's absolutely critical that you are not engaging with the new actors that are suddenly finding themselves on these sanction lists, individuals and entities. And it's important also to note that you're not just looking maybe at the name that is on your books, on your record, in your account, but you're looking at the flow through of business, because maybe 1 level, 2 levels, 3 levels down the chain of business, you may recognize that you have entities that are somehow in some manner caught up with the sanctions. So that's the first thing, the first impact right away on all the banks, international banks, domestic banks, etc. The next thing I want to bring, I don't want to repeat anything. So the one thing I want to bring to this is that we talk about SWIFT. SWIFT is the anti to blockchain and crypto, because as we know, SWIFT is the centralized, and that's the word there. It's a centralized way of transferring and moving funds. So Bank A wants to send funds to Bank B or receive, the funds go through SWIFT. So it's not peer-to-peer, B2B, it's not direct. Blockchain and cyber securities have come up with the almost, not the sole, but the main purpose to defeat that system and to decentralize. So while we are moving away or removing Russia from such a centralized system, the reality is a lot of the world has been attempting to move away from that centralized system. So what happens now? Right away, we are hearing that the EU and Europe, and USA are making attempts also to put sanctions and to limit access to blockchain and to the cryptos, etc. So what are we doing? Are we just pushing the movement of funds from a platform which it is understandable, which it is known, which we are familiar, to another platform which everyone up to today has not signed on to and say that it's a good way of moving money. So for process of time, I'm going to stop there and just leave that one tidbit for you guys to comment on.
And we'll come back to it, I'm sure, when we get in under cybersecurity. What I'd like to do is go back and hand the stage over to Mariano. And Mariano, you know, it's interesting. I know you don't have your camera, but one of the things I've been looking at is the price of gas in North America and what's happening. And one of the things I'd like, as you were talking about energy, is to try to understand what level of subsidy, what's happening to our oil now, and what's happening to what is the true price of gas in our own market, and what are the potential ramifications. But let me hand over to you. You were here. You said you had passed a presentation to someone, Mariano.
I sent it a couple of.
Yes, we got the presentation. Christy will share it in a second, but just before she does that, we would play, Christy, the second video. It's a 3-minute report from BBC on the energy side of things. And straight from the presentation, the video, Christy, we'll go to the slides for Mariano.
Lots of paper.
The reason for these grim forecasts is this. That's the wholesale price of gas, which is surging back towards all-time highs on fears that Russian gas supplies will be interrupted or internationally shunned. And to compound the cost of living crisis, there's the price of oil, which is at a 7-year high. And that recent spike is yet to make it to forecourts, where it seems likely that petrol and diesel prices will continue to break records. The UK gets less than 5% of its gas directly from Russia, but prices are set internationally, so we're affected. Germany, however, relies on Russia for over 60% of its gas, and those payments are helping prevent a total collapse of the ruble. That reliance and support needs to change, according to German politicians.
We cannot trust on reliable conditions with Russia, trade conditions on gas, and therefore we have to diversify our energy supply. What we're considering is the extension of the use of coal-fired power plants and of nuclear-fired power plants, because we want to become more independent from Russian gas.
Extending the use of coal in Europe was not in the script at November's Global Climate Summit, and it's a measure of the current crisis that it's back in now. Shipments of liquid gas are now the subject of international bidding wars in which consumers are the losers. The government has already announced a £350 assistance package to soften the blow, but with average bills set to rise 4 times that this year, there will be surely calls for more. Simon Jack, BBC News.
And what this attempts to do, I went back to pull out what the international associations were saying, and I'm using Moody's. This was Moody's 1 week ago. This is what they were looking at. All right, first of all, this was their presentation the day after Russia took action. So they have 2 scenarios: a rapid resolution and a lengthy resolution. Now note that they have resolution to the short side, because their argument, I think, is that the consequences of an invasion are so catastrophic that it's what you call it. It's going to have a disastrous effect on oil. And what happens if there were a low probability of what would take place, a lower probability? But I think right now we're tending towards the second scenario. We know that it's more than likely, given everything that is taking place, that this may be longer than we expect, that there are severe sanctions. But notice the third scenario is Russian oil and gas companies significantly reduce supplies to Europe. Now that hasn't taken place as yet. All right, now when that takes place, and this is to take the position that this is to answer the question that was being asked directly by our moderator, Gabriel, right? You're looking at oil prices over $150 a barrel, and you're looking at gas prices at $50 per MMBTU. Now we have to remember that in terms of where we are, in terms of gas prices, in terms of MMBTU, using Henry Hub, we're talking about 4 to 5. We're talking about at the upper limit. Let's say today's trending towards $5. Well, just think about the effect, the economic effect of $50 per MMBTU. All right. Now that's a 10% That's about 1,000% increase. Well, just think about the effect of that in terms of rippling across all economies. So going back to the presentation, and I'm happy that Ian talked about the bifurcation, and I'm also happy that he talked about the, well, effectively, he didn't use the words, but unintended consequences, right? Well, so far, what we've considered are only the consequences of Western actions. We haven't stopped, and so far the world, certainly the Western press, the Western media, hasn't started to factor in the reverse. What would happen, and what is the transmission effect? Well, the transmission effect, as pointed out by Ian, are going to be the world's commodity markets. Because essentially, because we are globalized, because we all import, then by definition, whatever takes place on the world markets is the prices that we are going to get. And since energy is central to literally almost every item, every product, and every area of an economy, any movement in energy prices will reverberate across all commodities. All commodities. And that includes food. That includes the direct knock-on prices in terms of literally almost anything that you produce, right? I mean, you could use as a dummy variable the supply side shocks we've had as a result of COVID-19. And we've seen the effects from an inflationary point of view. The IMF and the World Bank have already downgraded forecasts of the world outlook because of the basis of inflation, largely associated with the knock-on effects of COVID and its effect on the supply chain. Well, now put on the energy impact of increased prices. Well, we're no longer talking about inflation in the real sense of the term. We can't predict the amount of inflation we're talking about. If we had to go through some of this area, we could model, we could develop some scenarios, right? So that it is literally in almost everybody's interest that this action, this war, this fighting that is taking place between Russia and Ukraine stop as quickly as possible, because the effects on an economic perspective could be catastrophic. What is the relevant example? Well, we have to go back to the impact of OPEC in 1974, 1976, where we talked about stagflation. We talked about interest rates in North America reaching 14 and 15%. We talked about three-day work weeks in Europe for a period of time. Well, that is the type of scenario, and that would be the type of consequence of Russia returning the favor to the West. And that's the second scenario, right? Now, what about metal and mineral shortages in the case of building? What about in the case of manufacturing planes, for example, which require, or chips, which require a series of rare earths, which are produced a significant share of the world market is controlled by Russia and Ukraine, right? What about the impact on the price of wheat, right? Most people may not recognize it, but in terms of production of wheat, Canada is about 6, right? Russia and Ukraine between them would come in about 4 or 5. So that you're talking about a significant impact on prices of food, on a basic foodstuffs. We're talking about wheat in particular, right? Certainly some on the grain market. So there are a lot of knock-on effects. So just looking at the scenario in terms of what's possible, well, I think we're somewhere between, I think scenario 1, we've already hit that. We're talking about $110 per barrel, at 108, 109, we are that already. We already know that we're under pressure. Everybody else is taking certain actions. All of the actions that Ian has talked about are already in process. People are looking at the exposures and taking action. So far, the only one that was not responded in kind, except for the action in the West, is Russia. And that has not taken place. So the factor that has to be taken into consideration for the impact on the transmission mechanism was, what if Russia were to start turning off the pipes? Now, that carries us to this, just to look, if we could go to the second slide, which basically takes off from where we were. You'll notice that the blue, which is liquefied natural gas, as a percentage of the supply chain, you'll see it's heaviest in blue, and this comes from the Energy Administration. This was published, I think, it certainly was published this week, but imports by pipeline and from sources. Well, Russia, you notice, is probably the biggest source. Domestic production accounts for less than 40% of the total requirements. All right, so if you add in domestic production and the total and the imports from Norway, which is literally not a member of Euro, but it's close to it, you're talking about somewhere between 40 and 50% coming from domestic sources, but a substantial portion coming from Russian sources. So, and losing 10% or 20% in terms of your production capacity can be catastrophic. So that's what we're looking at. And we have already seen, and this is up to 2020. I'm not too certain where we are at today's date. So if you go to the next slide would sort of put it in position in terms of prices. This is what has already started happening to prices. This is before the difficulties in Ukraine. The spikes are taking place in the last part of that graph are all taking place literally where Russia had sort of surrounded. And that up to January, at the end of January, the prices started to come back down. But since then, it has gone back up. Right? So we are talking, and look at the substantial difference in the pricing structure between the price of gas in Europe and the price of gas. So there's a huge margin, a huge space. The difficulty in transporting or getting gas from North America to Europe in terms of liquefied natural gas is that not merely that this is expensive by way of capital investment, by way of terminals. The point is they don't have the capacity to be able to switch from the sources that they currently have. Now, Olaf, the president of Germany yesterday talked about, or the chancellor started talking about using more coal, using more nuclear fuel. But Germany turned off its nuclear reactors a few years ago. So can they restart those plants in a week, 2 weeks? How long is the lead time to get nuclear reactors back up to steam? And by the way, what this does is throw the whole concept of global warming out through the window, which raises other issues. The next slide deals with its impact in terms of the world, in terms of what the scenarios look like, in terms of what's possible, given slower growth, given the changes in the energy sector. Now, these are all based upon a baseline prediction, right? A baseline prediction. In other words, this is what we would have expected using the normal growth curve. So we're going to move away from that. In other words, they're projecting over 22, 23, a kind of coming, look at the scenario. We're talking about a decline, a substantial decline, a movement away, a movement downwards in terms of what the numbers are. Now, this does not take into consideration any retaliatory action out of Russia with regard to gas supplies. If that were to happen, then by definition, the scenarios that we're looking at are completely different, right? So a price of gas in Europe at $50 per MMBTU would have a considerable knock-on effect in terms of production and supplies elsewhere in the world. Now, that has significant implications for the world economy as well as for the prices of energy. And by definition, if it affects the price of energy, which touches everything else, and I'm not talking about any of the other products, by definition, we're talking about an inflationary splurge, an inflationary surge, right? And that's, I think, is on the cards. We have already started to see the impact of inflation from items associated with and the effects of COVID. That alone has already pushed up the inflation rate in the North American market to its highest level for, I can't remember how many years, about 20 or 30 years, right? To the extent to which that the Fed is already starting to talk about, and not talk, is what you're actually talking, specific numbers, which we have not ever heard before. The Fed is actually signaling what percentage rates of change that they're looking at. So we have the effect, the transmission effect, which is what Ian talked about. The transmission effect is going to be through the world's financial markets, right? And if the world's financial markets, the major markets, are beginning to slow growth, then by definition, in the Caribbean, we are also going to see higher prices, slower growth. That's the result. The next chart just carries it one step further. It looks at the rates of change. If you could just change the slide there for me, please. Right. So this was what you use in February as a baseline. This is what they're expecting moving forward. We're talking about inflation rates for the world averaging somewhere about 3%, which is up from, we were much lower than that before. So 2% is still high. But if we take the retaliatory effects, these numbers are going to be blown out through the door. We're going to talk about much more significant numbers. So this is only just taking into consideration Moody's analysis using a February baseline, and this is what they were anticipating before the Russian invasion, the full-scale invasion. They will now have to go back and revise all of their numbers, and their numbers are going to be, how shall we call it? I would expect the numbers will show a completely different positioning in terms of where we're going to go. And the transmission effect is going to be true in the first instance through energy costs, right? So we're talking about moving from 110 to $160 a barrel of oil, right? And that means that all of the relative pricing formulation required in each economy is going to change. Now, we've been there before. What was the highest price that we went to? $114? Is $114 we were at in 2014? Well, what we're talking about we're talking about exceeding that by at least another, what? Another 30%? So we're talking about substantial changes. Now, at the time, in 2014, when prices crashed and we considered the highest price was about $114, we were talking where all of the central banks around the world had been for the last 6 years in response to the depression of 2008. We had all been operating at very low or negative interest rates, literally zero. Now we'll be talking about moving into a scenario where energy prices are high, it's going to have an inflationary impact, and the central banks are going to raise rates. So what is on the scenario? On this scenario, we're talking about a transmission mechanism that is going to take place through the world's energy markets, through the world's commodity markets, and they're going to have a huge impact in terms of our inflationary situation. We already know that the outlook that between the World Bank and the IMF, they have already knocked off roughly about 10 or 12% of the growth rate that was expected for this year. Right. So if 10% has been knocked off just on the basis of pure responses to or the negative impact of COVID, then by definition, we can expect a magnitude which is completely different if all of the worst case scenarios, or if you want the lengthier scenario, that if the longer this conflict take place between Russia and Ukraine, the higher energy prices, and not only higher energy prices, the higher the inflation. So the outlook is for one of stagflation. And that is really where I'd leave it for the time being.
Mariano, thank you very, very much for that. I want to ask a question. I don't want an answer now. What I'll do is I'd like to make sure we have the other two speakers give their contributions, and I'd like to mark the spot on that. You have identified, and of course we've seen the increased costs, the impact of COVID, and now compounded by this. But what does this mean for the Trinidad and Tobago economy? As I said, I don't want to answer now, Mariano. Let's wait till we have a little bit more, because hearing the price of oil and hearing the price of gas, what does that mean for the Trinidad and Tobago economy? So that's my question, but I'll wait for that answer at the end of the session. What I'd like to do instead is I'd like to ask Dr. Hughes to come on, but before he comes on, we have a short video that's going to talk about the supply chain impact of this issue, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Hughes for him to provide his input. Kamala, could we get good? Great, it's coming on. Christy's putting it on.
The cost of heating your home, the cost of travel, groceries, mortgage payments, car prices, all of them are expected to get hit if this conflict is stretched further. That's because both Russia and Ukraine are crucial to global supply chains. The world depends on them for energy, fuel, food items, and automobile parts. This war could disrupt supplies of all four and more, the effects of which will be felt way beyond Europe. Here's a report.
The conflict in Ukraine may be geographically distant, but the consequences of Putin's aggression could have ripple effects way beyond Ukraine. From the availability of food to the cost of energy and petrol and the prices of airline tickets. This conflict runs the risk of impacting your daily life.
Dr. Hughes, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks again once more for having me. This was at very short notice, and I did have a discussion with the Chamber of Commerce about some of the points I want to raise today, many of which have already been put on the agenda. Just to say that this conflict, from my perspective, is not over. It's not at the middle of it, it's just the beginning of the beginning. And therefore, we all have to plan for a very long, medium to long-term impact of all the fallouts that we have seen or heard outlined to us today. The critical thing for us in the Caribbean, I would say, is what are the commodity flow impacts, what are the financial flow impacts, and also what are the geopolitical considerations that we will have to look at, because as was pointed out earlier, I think we're going to be called upon in one way or the other to, in a sense, take side of this great debate or divide. The adjustments to this conflict, which is going to be ongoing, is going to be, as someone pointed out, by energy and commodity prices immediately. But the impact is going to be running through the financial system, and therefore it's going to be very, very direct and very immediate. To talk somewhat about the supply chain disruption, I want to identify shipping. It's very instructive that in our discussion, no one has mentioned the impact of COVID. It's as if that crisis has disappeared. But if you think back, a few weeks ago, this was the main content on the news. And the impact that had on shipping and container availability and the cost of shipping out of Asia was having a direct impact on inflation in the Caribbean and availability of goods across the region. I think this is going to exacerbate all of that. And shipping costs are likely to keep going up and remain high from where they are today. When you build that into the model, based on what's happening to commodity prices and other goods and services, the point about the stagflation effect is real. And many of us are not old enough to remember what stagflation looked like in the 1970s. But this is going to be, in my judgment, the likely outcome. Significant reduction in GDP growth, uptick in inflation, even for a relatively short period of time, because the availability of goods and services will be reduced. The risks are too great. Uncertainty, which is not a friend of business, will mean that decisions for investments and decisions about immediate business operations will be delayed, or the cost of them will go up significantly. So the world is in a very, very serious, very unfriendly environment, very uncertain environment. And in that scenario, as was pointed out, GDP is likely to significantly contract. So this is already happening. Prices are going to be going up, and that was happening before this immediate crisis. And my point, genuinely to be made, this is going to be persisting in the short to medium term, if not longer. And even if the war were to end tonight, the built-in sanctions and the difficulty of unwinding that, because that now becomes a political issue. It becomes an issue in Europe versus the United States, NATO versus the EU, etc. The difficulty of unwinding that will be a protracted period of instability, uncertainty, and no one will know whether this is going to be resumed or continued or intensified. The point that was made earlier that Russia has not yet responded the way it could respond is an important one. But there are unintended consequences and risks that could be realized. And one such is the disruption of energy flow from Russia into Western Europe as a result of military action in Ukraine. Ukraine carries a large proportion of energy into Western Europe from Russia. And you have fighting. I mean, last night there was an impact, some attack around a nuclear power plant. If you can have fighting around a nuclear power plant, you know, a gas or oil pipeline is quite in order to be. And that disruption may come despite the willingness to maintain the flow. And when that happens, the impact is going to be a quick response in terms of spike in prices and other.
You to know, Dr. Hughes, you can actually just hit the arrow next to your microphone and test your speaker while we're doing that without bothering us. So you can actually go in and test it. And what I'll do is I will move on to the next speaker, right? But before I do, I'd just like the group to know one of the key takeaways, I think, from Dr. Hughes and based on what Mariano said, is that we need to recognize that the direct exports and imports from Russia and Ukraine, or to Russia and Ukraine, are minuscule. I mean, believe it or not, Russia exports 194 million to CARICOM, which is just 0.5% of their total exports. And the largest importer in CARICOM was Bahamas, importing around 61 million, which was in fuel and oils. Interestingly, CARICOM exports $80 million to Russia, which is less than 0.1% of CARICOM exports. And a large percentage of that comes from Jamaica. So I just wanted to put that from a perspective. And I think it's important we as a group understand that the impact is not going to be direct. It is going to be indirect. Now, Ukraine, on the other hand, exports 43 million to CARICOM, which is less than 1% of its exports. And that goes to Haiti and Bahamas and St. Kitts. And those were boats and iron ore, ships and iron ore. And they only import 18 million, which is less than 1/3%, which is iron ore, and again, from Jamaica, so it could be bauxite, seafood from Belize, and beverages. So from a group, we need to understand that the direct impact on this is not significant. It is the ripple impact based on the fact that, as Mariano said, so much oil, so much wheat, so much input, so much commodities these two countries provide, that if you can't buy from those countries, you now have to pay more for them from other sources, right? So I just want to highlight that. The next speaker, Derrick Cummins, is coming to talk about cybersecurity. And I don't know if people have been reading about this, but we have seen that there are groups who are attacking either Ukraine or Russia from a cybersecurity perspective and the impact that's having. But what I'd like to do first is get a short video from Christy to introduce the topic before Derrick comes on board. So Christy, over to you.
A period of significantly increased risk.
Adam, it's Brian Chung here. You mentioned surrogates. What exactly does that mean? Is that like a third party that could be hacking United States targets, for example? I guess elaborate a little bit exactly what that terminology means.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, on the one hand, within Russia, certain ransomware groups, I mean, the Conti ransomware group has already come out and said they're going to be supportive, of Russia and retaliating against any, cyber tradecraft coming in from the West. Now, interestingly, Conti itself has been hacked, and so we're learning a huge amount about, that threat actor group. But Ukraine has also called for an army of cyber defenders, to help stave off attacks. We have seen groups actually attack the Belarusian railroad to slow down, Russian advances into Ukraine.
Adam, you've highlighted one of the key risks here, which are super spreader events or potential for super spreaders. What does that look like?
Well, to use I'm a Star Wars fan, and so I kind of think of Order 66, which is, where clones were kind of converted into, Jedi hunters, by an order from the Emperor. But the basic idea is you have, if you think back to the SolarWinds compromise that we all learned about a year ago, situation where when software that's widely dispersed is itself compromised, either because malware is inserted into it or because there's an exploitable vulnerability that's leveraged, you have the ability to have an effect across, a very large number of victim organizations. That's what a super spreader event is.
Over to Mr. Cummins. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And as I said earlier, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, indeed, banking and investment management is my background. As a bank executive, security and cybersecurity is critical to all that we do. We used to say at one point in the last 5 years that the only area in banking that is growing is compliance and compliance management and that area. But now definitely the spend on security and cybersecurity and network security is substantially even more than in compliance. What I want to begin with, I want to say that central to winning wars has always been winning the minds of people. Owning the rhetoric, propaganda message, whatever you call it, and the channels of distribution is critical. Controlling access to truth, your truth, access to reality, your reality, especially today with information so readily at hand, is critical. So with that, communication and information technology now are weapons of war like never before. Cyber conflict is far-reaching. Yes, we are worlds away from Ukraine and Russia, it seems, but cyber conflict is far-reaching geographically, industry-wise, people-wise, and as far as governments. One thing I would say, one very quick thing is last week I was amazed by some of our people, somewhat being upset that our politicians spoke out against and denounced the movement of the actions of Russia. The reality is we're in a global world, and whether you say yeah or nay or abstain, you have spoken. But persons were wondering, why don't we just keep quiet and hide? There's no keeping quiet and hiding in this world of amazing connectivity. What I will say, and what has been evidenced this time around, remember in 2015, after 2014, what was the annex of Crimea? In 2015, Russian government hackers breached the Ukrainian power grid, leading to widespread outages. Again in 2017, they deployed what is known as the NotPetya malware via a Ukrainian accounting software. And it's so important because these days we get software from any location. We get software from the Play Store, from Apple, wherever, but so much of this software is developed in places that we would never thought of. And we get software from not only the USA, not only from Europe, but Central, Eastern Europe, from Asia, from Africa, from many, many places. And they use this Ukrainian accounting software to spread viruses quickly across the globe. It costs businesses billions of damage and disruption. What we found this time around in 2022, what Russia has done as far as cyber conflict has been less savvy and has been somewhat surprising. And the main thing they have done was the denial of service, whereby they just make the web pages very, very busy and cause traffic congestion on the website, and therefore persons cannot get on. It causes the operators to close the website for a while, let that traffic ease, and then it reopens. So it have caused people to wonder just how savvy and how sophisticated or not the Russian cyber ability is. But it's proven in the past to be highly damaging, and there is no need to at this point doubt that again it can be as damaging as they wish. What the speaker just said prior is that what we found is like groups like Anonymous has so far started counter cyber conflict, bringing damage to Russian banks and other Russian facilities. So maybe the recognition that there is, let's say, non-state actors who are willing to oppose them, maybe that is causing Russia pause into as far as the extent to which they will go. Before I continue specifically with Russia, with Ukraine, so some statistics which I'm sure you've all heard about cybersecurity and cyber crimes in the last few years. According to Fortinet.com, cybersecurity is a growing concern for businesses of all sizes. Okay, businesses of all sizes and in all regions, as cyber criminals increasingly sophisticated tactics continue to disrupt organizations. It is projected that businesses will spend more than $170 billion on cybersecurity in 2022. Can you imagine the opportunity cost there? What else can a business be doing? What other investments can you be doing towards your core business to grow your business? Separate from that, you are diverting billions of dollars to do with cybersecurity. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has also caused major impact on cybersecurity. Online scams spiked more than 400% in 2020. Google revealed that it's blocking more than 18 million malware and phishing emails related only to COVID-19 on a daily basis. Data breaches resulted in 36 billion records being exposed in the first three quarters of 2020. The use of malware increased 358% in 2020. Ransomware increased 435% compared to the previous year. More than 90% of the US healthcare organizations suffered at least one cybersecurity breach in the previous 3 years. The first thing I want us to notice is that these actors zero in on what is new and what is topical and what is current. And they change the game, they change the target based on the circumstance in the world. The cost of cybercrime. Cybercrime costs organizations $2.9 million every minute. The major businesses lose $25 per minute as a result of data breaches, according to Risk IQ. According to research by IBM, it takes 280 days to find and contain the average cyber attack. Well, the average attack costs $3.86 million. So not only it's costing you in dollars, but it's costing you in time. How long will it take you? And then what is your loss of revenue to get your business back to operating on full scale? And I can continue with data after data. Again, cyber risks. Cisco data estimates that distributed denial of service attacks will grow 15.4%, grow to $15.4 million by 2023. So again, this is the main thing that Russia seems to be doing with Ukraine, denial of service attacks. And we expected this to grow astronomically in the coming years. And this data is prior to anyone contemplating that Russia would make the move on Ukraine. And more than 4/5 of data breaches in 2020, 86% of us were financially motivated. But now we see as actors move from individual to corporate to state, that the motivation isn't only financial, but the motivations and the reasonings behind such activity has grown. I want to go to itgovernance.co.uk reported 1st of March that cybersecurity industry, much of the rest of the world, is on edge. Our figures for this month are comparably low. And they were saying that the figures for breaches in February 2022 were comparatively low. And that figure was 83 data breaches, accounting for $5.1 million of breach records. And that's considered low. The next thing they noted is that the end of February, when this mission began, there was a severe intensity in the final days of February, a flurry of security incidences. It was either directly related to Ukraine or indirectly related to Ukraine. It's mentioned again, Russia targeted banks and government departments, and Ukraine attempted an attack on the Moscow Stock Exchange. What we know, as I said, the EU has responded to a call of help from Ukraine to set up a cyber rapid response team. It comprised of 12 volunteers who will help cyber attack victims. And as I said, the hacking group Anonymous has been aggressively attempting to launch or to give Russia a bit of a taste of its own medicine. So the first thing to see is that it is global, it is far-reaching. It's not confined to a geographical space. It is not enough for us to say it's something happening over there, but won't get us here. The next thing we look at is that, again, the immense cost for security, the immense downtime for an action on your organization, whether you're a small organization, whether you're a bank, whether you're not for profit. What I will want to say also is that cybersecurity is critical at every level of life. It's critical for securing all that you have built up. In our homes, we use it more. Our fridges are online. Our cameras are outside and inside our house. We unlock our homes from in another country. There's so many things in our homes now that are targets in our schools, our examinations, corporate world, and even in our states. But the one thing I would want to say is that crises have always hastened right actions. So in the face of crisis, we find a way to do the right things. We find a way to get quicker to the positions that we ought already to be. And if businesses have not heeded the word for the last few years about the need to be savvy, to do your penetration testing, to make sure that you spend sufficiently, that you can represent that you have done everything reasonable to secure the data and the security of the data of your clients and customers. Now, this definitely brings that to the fore. What we can say is that despite high spending, hackers still manage to compromise corporate data and systems with relative ease. And why is this? Because many organizations continue to lack cybersecurity awareness. They utilize poor practices. If your organization still allows your team to change their passwords every 2 months, you have a problem. If for most of your logging in, you are using just a password and not a two-step authentication system, you possibly have a problem. The issue facing the next issue that faces us and makes us vulnerable is as we continue to look at remote workforces. We are no longer working in one place that could be somewhat umbreled or covered by our cybersecurity, but now we are working remotely. You can log in at home, you can log in at a cafe, please don't do that. But the reality is there are more and more things opening us up to the potential for attacks. And as it relates to the long haul, the first thing that we need to recognize, ask ourselves, what is the exit strategy for sanctions? What is the end game here for the world. Sanctions are not added today and removed tomorrow. So even if Russia withdrew today, pay reparations to Ukraine tomorrow, making Ukraine whole, less the unfortunate loss of lives, sanctions are not reversed automatically. So there is enough time for these bad actors to recognize that if Russia can so openly, if one state can so openly, why can I now even more so be open and shrewd in my acting? Where are the targets? Where are the vulnerabilities? Maybe the European Union and most of their entities have strong firewalls and strong security cultures, and I can't get in. But what about the Caribbean? Are they as strong, or do I go and look to breach what we may call low-hanging fruit? May I look to install ransomware in a less sophisticated organization? So while it's hard to say that there will be direct impact to the region from a cybersecurity position, we know that the impacts can be indirect, again, for all three of the areas that we discussed before. Financial, if there's attack on the financial system, it can cripple us. If there's attack on the delivery of oil, it can cripple us. If there's an attack on the delivery or on our movement of goods supply chain, it can be crippling to small countries like we are in the region. The next thing that gives me some pause is that Russia, we think, believes that NATO is too close to its borders. What if Russia decides to take a new look at all nations close to the US borders? This is a Cold War stance, but Cold War seems to be warming up. I must say, in the very first presentation today, my computer went out. As soon as I went on the website to look to see which were the 35 nations that abstained on the UN vote this week, my computer crashed and I thought, oh, there's something went wrong. It was just that my computer overheated and I had to log back in. But I know that at least 3 countries in our region abstained from that vote. Again, this discussion isn't about geopolitics, but we just note that there are friendlier nations very, very much on our doorstep. So we have to consider this.
Derrick, what I'd like to do, Derrick, what I'd like to do as you're moving off the cybersecurity aspect, we have just coming on 15 minutes. So if you could wrap up, I'd like to get some of the general questions and have a general discussion. So let me let you wrap up.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to wrap it in 30 seconds. Just a quick talk about the metaverse. As we seek to find easy ways of doing everything, we've always heard of the Internet of Things, but now the metaverse is the Internet of all things. The more we get more technologically dependent, the more we open ourselves up for potential attacks. So we will find there will be enhanced spending on cybersecurity. That will be the major outcome from a cyber security fallout from this current ongoing conflict. So I will pause there for now.
Thank you very much, Derrick. What I'd like to do is we still have 65 people on it. We have committed to making this session closing at 4. But I would like to ask attendees to put questions. We will have a general discussion while we're waiting on your questions. I would like Mr. Browne to answer my question. I know costs are going up, but Mariano, what does this mean for? Is this a savior for the Trinidad and Tobago economy?
No, it isn't. Quite the opposite. Okay. So it's going to make things a lot harder for us because we're importing all of our energy, so that the increased costs of importation of imported fuel and world market prices immediately transfers to the pump, and so it automatically
higher subsidies then. So higher subsidies then.
Well, I don't even think that we can pay the subsidies given the quantum of increases that we're talking about. So even if you were tempted to do that at $114, we are talking about a subsidy of approximately what, $6-7 billion. Right. So just imagine if we and then we still had Petrotrim still operating. So imagine if you had anything going to $120 again, and that's just the raw cost of oil. That's not including the what you conversion costs. So quite frankly, the country is not going to be able to subsidize it. Two countries that are best poised in the region are Suriname and Guyana. From that perspective, and in our case, quite frankly, I don't see any real benefit at all. If you have higher prices on the LNG side, unless you have solved the long-running dispute with regard to how the energy prices, the transfer pricing formula works out, I don't see that translated into significantly higher revenues. That's the first point. The second point, the input costs on the other side, the cost structure with regard to the energy sector, sorry, the petrochemical plants. It probably means that the petrochemical plants are probably the best bet of revenue transmission, because we know there's a fixed price somewhere in the region about $3.75 per MMBTU with regard to the petrochemical gas contracts, and the prices of ammonia. That's one of the reasons why most of the plants are up and running, right? Because even at lower production cost, the contribution margin is so large that they could actually pay the increased the cost of increasing the turnarounds to keep the plants functioning at lower volume levels. So I think that from a revenue transmission point, the biggest tax stake is going to come from your petrochemical sector. Now, that is going to be counterbalanced by the effect on prices with regard to continued subsidies with regard to cooking gas, and on the other side at the pump. I don't think that we will be generating enough revenue to be able to pay for it. And in fact, the extra revenue, I don't think is going to be sufficient to offset the prices at the pump. So I don't see this being, I think that lots of people are going to see this as being a windfall gain. I don't see it as a windfall gain at all. I see it as it's going to be very difficult.
I think that's something that as a lay person, you always say when energy price. We've always said when energy prices go up, we win. So I think I think it was a question I was trying to figure out with you when I saw your graph showing the increased prices for oil and for natural gas. So I'm quite surprised actually.
And I'll tell you why. Because roughly we're producing. You have to remember we're producing. Roughly 60% of what we used to produce in 2011, right? And that's split between LNG and the petrochemical sector. So that the impact is going to be on the petrochemical sector, but whatever revenues you're going to be getting, they're going to be at a much lower level because you don't have the production volume. You don't have the production volume. So if you don't have the production volume, but on the other hand, you're paying significantly more for the imported energy. Well, if you pay significantly more for the imported energy, the bottom line is, and you want to cushion the effect, because this is going to lead to cost push inflation in Trinidad immediately. And then think about it. We haven't begun the negotiations, and we still are negotiating in arrears in terms of public servant salary. And
that's not good. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we go in there immediately because that's a situation of a relative instability. Quite frankly, that's right on the table very quickly. So I don't see that being positive for us at all.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that cleared up. I saw Kevin Baldiosing put a comment, and I'm assuming it's a comment. I don't think it was a question. So those persons can see the comment. Marlene Street from the Jamaica Stock Exchange made a comment, and I think it's an interesting thought that we should all discuss. And Wesley, Derrick, yourself, I know Ian had to leave. Nearshoring, the opportunity which was accelerated by COVID and may be further accelerated by this war, if you want to call it that. Is there an opportunity for us to start sourcing from our neighbors and look more to create, I'm going to use a COVID term, a bubble can I put that to the panel? Be it probably Wesley. Were you able to get your mic operational now?
I'm not sure. You tell me. Are you hearing me?
It works. It works. Excellent. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Excellent. Yeah. So you are supply chain, and I think Marlene's question kind of links to that supply chain aspect. You know, Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad as sources of commodities, finished goods. Is there a silver lining for us? And I'd like to ask everybody on the panel, but let's start with Wesley.
My first comment on that is that the shipping business has been disrupted prior to this conflict in Europe, and has not gotten back to normality or normalcy. Prices are still going up. One of the things I learned about the shipping business is that once those super liners or super container ships came online, they literally cut up the smaller ships. And so you now need huge ships to take a relative small amount of cargo, and you don't move until you have a critical minimum amount. And so that is disrupting the business. Not to mention the absence of containers going back to their normal place of abode. So you have that ongoing problem now being compounded by disruptions that are going to take place as people try to sort out their trading arrangement, new trading arrangements, and the sanctions. I see opportunities for the Caribbean in terms of cruise shipping. Returning after COVID has been dealt with in a sense, because people are going to be moving their ships out of Europe probably into the Caribbean because it's a less volatile area for tourism or cruise shipping. I also see the likelihood of tourism rebounding a little bit faster in the region as against Europe or Asia or elsewhere, because again, the disruption that has taken place in long-haul flights, which will not be resolved anytime soon because of the sanctions and the banning of planes flying across different countries. I also see possibilities for education in the region. The universities will now have an opportunity if they can adjust their costs and offerings to take account of some of the students who would have gone to different countries. It may be a small area, but it does show the possibilities that can emerge from a conflict. Despite how chaotic or difficult it is, there are possibilities in other services, not just education, but people do travel to Europe and elsewhere for other things. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Wesley. We now, just for the group to know, we have 7 minutes. With the group's permission, we will continue the discussion for us, if the panel is available, for a couple of minutes after, just to try to wrap up. I'm seeing more questions coming on. But nearshoring, Mariano, your thoughts on that and the impact on the region. As I said, looking at Jamaica, Guyana, where there's so much commodity availability, what are your thoughts on the opportunity there? On Marlene's question.
The real problem is our relative size in terms of that opportunity. We have spare capacity, but not spare capacity to cater to the world. Now, here's the real option that I see. Europe, because it has become much more volatile, because it is now a theater of war operations. The Caribbean is relatively far. Now, we have, it's a better place to work from, given what is taking place in Europe than it is there. Now, so far, the only country in the region that has effectively put a policy in position to be able to address is Barbados. None of us have started to consider it from that perspective at all. We are so focused in terms of our initial problems that we're not seeing some of the opportunities where that is concerned. Now, consider, we're talking about, for example, we've been always talking about a brain drain. What about using the opportunity that this creates for reversing that flow, right? Now, it's a huge opportunity, right? But we also it means that we have to tidy up our social systems. We have to tidy up our level of organization, because Europeans are not accustomed to some of the habits of being that are commonplace in the region. So that if we really want to take advantage of those type of opportunities, this becomes an opportunity for us, in a sense, to move beyond an inward-looking perspective to a more outward-looking perspective in terms of what is possible to do from our region that makes living here a lot better for people who are in a different place. But also means that it has to work its way right across the systems. What does that boil down to? The ease of doing business. All the other things.
Our favorite topic. Our favorite topic.
Our favorite topic. So that for me is a critical design area. So that what we need to be talking about is policy responses, not merely in terms of the impact of inflation, but we now have to take this is going to take its time to weigh itself, work its way through the system. So this is not going to be, it's going to have an immediate impact. So by definition, we have to have a longer term policy response, right? In terms of where do we reposition the society? Because what we've been doing before doesn't address the situation at all.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to ask the panelists to do is let's tighten up on the answers because we have about 4 minutes if we take another 10 minutes after. But I see Kevin made a comment on commentators have argued that the past decade of ESG encouraged and empowered Putin. What is it now? I'm not too sure if that's I don't want to get into a discussion on Putin, so to speak. So, Kevin, I understand the direction you're going in. I don't know, Kamala, can I get some direction from you on this?
No, with the short time remaining, I prefer we focus on the impact on the Caribbean.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. So, Tricia, I think that's JMMB. What's the impact on investment funds like hedge funds, ETFs, exposure to Russia and Ukraine? But Tricia, you might be the best one to answer that question, but let's see if maybe Derrick or someone else might want, and Tricia, I'll be happy if you would like to comment on it. I know you have put the question on the table, but if you would like to put it, it's a meeting and we value your expertise in the area. What are your thoughts, Tricia? You want to come on?
Sure. I mean, it's a very deep question, right? Because what we're gonna be looking at is knowing who have exposure to those funds and who has direct exposure to investments in Russia. So does houses in Trinidad or the region have exposure to direct Russian bonds or companies of that sort? And then ultimately, then you have the bypass, which is through the states, through some of those hedge funds and those ETFs and stuff like that, the impact of it and where it would hit us. And I mean, I think it's very early phase, but based on what Ian Narine was suggesting, it is likely that we will feel the impact of it some point sequentially down the line. Because I mean, there's no way, we're more globalized now than we were before. 10 years, 20 years ago, we're far more globalized. Our funds are commingled in many different ways.
That's a very good point, Tricia. Derrick, would you like to comment on it from your finance perspective? We'll go to Mariano after.
Yes, for sure. I mean, as I said earlier, the first thing everybody did was to scrub their list of clients and intermediaries to see if there was any linkages to Russia or any of the sanctioned entities. The reality is that you may even in your ETF, an ETF may have many 100 or more exposures, or you may just be your pension fund exposed to an entity which on the face of it is maybe Euro or US, but it has a 25% share in a Russian entity that may or may not be sanctioned. So, there are problems like that. Now, an ETF with exposure, we like to liquidate positions orderly. as an investment manager, does the ETF have the ability to liquidate orderly and at good value any exposure to the Russian market, or do you have to rush and find a way to sell quickly and sell at a major haircut discount? And who's going to buy anyway? So you may have an ETF which may have frozen positions for the next 3 years, and that can impact the value of your investment.
And there's no market, So good point.
But
Mariano, your input.
Well, I was going to ask the question. This is related to what does BP do? I think that's probably the best example. And I think that a number of companies like Citibank came out, they were writing off $100 million. Well, that's pocket change in large measure. So it's really going to be, and those type of funds, who from the Caribbean is going to be involved in those type of funds? And are they the type of people who can really afford those losses in any event? They would probably have been transitioning part of their wealth out of the Caribbean from that perspective. So it may have no real direct or significant an impact in our own market. So my position is not so much on the financial markets, because I accept that there will be an impact. I just don't know how much. I think that the critical issue for us is that the repositioning impact. We are, to a large extent, we are open economies. Trade matters to us. Trade matters to us. And that's going to be a significant focus. We are wired largely into the Western economies through the US, but we also have had, over the last 10, 20 years, we've had a greater impact in terms of China. Now, China hasn't entered the discussion at all today, right? And by definition, that has to be something that we have to consider in terms of what are the other possibilities that could happen. You know, how would China respond? What does China do? What is the West?
Hello.
Lost you.
Yeah, Chair, I'd like
Chair,
I'd like to ask a question. Yeah. Yeah. So the impact on is that Mariano back on?
Let's see if Mariano is back.
Okay, well let me
Mariano.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, he's back. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
go ahead, Mariano.
Yeah, I'm just saying that I'm thinking that the bigger impact for us is trade, right?
Yeah.
And our position with trade. And trade, we have two large players that we deal with. One, the American market. Two, the Chinese market. Right? We haven't started to talk about China at all.
Yeah. And just as a point for the group to know, China is the largest trading partner with Russia, accounting for over 15% of total Russian exports. So just as a separate point. Let me go back. Let me go to Howard. Howard, you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, please, thanks. And I'm glad to bring in China, because Mariano was mentioning that Russia has not retaliated. And my question really is, can they? Because with the sanctions that have been put in place and the observation by China today that in the beginning they were Russia's friend, but right now what is going on with Russia? They're kind of backing off, and even companies within China are cutting off links with Russia. So the impact on Russia's GDP with the sanctions that are in place are estimated, it depends on who you read, about 10% of their GDP. Now, could they retaliate? Because if they retaliate, it would put another 5% pressure on their GDP. The people will be suffering as is. Is that a realistic assumption to believe that Russia can retaliate by not selling gas and oil? Mariano?
Sorry, gentlemen. We only have a few minutes and we have questions with respect to the region. So we have a question from Shireen Ramdial.
Sorry, one second. That is really a regional thing, because if they retaliate, Mariano's point is that will also impact us as a region.
Yeah.
So the question really is, can they? You know?
Well,
is it
at
a
the end of the
realistic
day,
expectation? Yeah.
Well, if they don't, the alternative is a super peace immediately. So as far as I'm concerned, from what I see, the world has to look for a face-saving formula quickly, right? Because anytime a person is cornered, anytime a country is cornered, then you will find that they're likely to take extreme actions. So they don't retaliate immediately. They don't cut off 41%, they cut off 10%. Because by definition, if you are saying that you are cutting me off from the world system, The option, if I do nothing, then it means I've surrendered. How do I get you to the negotiating table? And the answer is the law of acceptable losses. How much am I prepared to lose? Because I have to bring you to the negotiating table.
Thanks a lot, Mariano, for that. As Kamla said, we have some questions. The Russia-Venezuela, I mean, while it's an impact on the region, we don't, interestingly, we don't do, the biggest business we do with Venezuela is migrants. So I'm not sure what the impact is, but anybody have any thoughts? Tight answers, please. Mariano.
The geopolitical impact. It's close.
Okay.
It has, Venezuela is in the position of Cuba, but it has something that Cuba doesn't have. It has energy reserves. That's the difference.
Right.
And it has a next door neighbor that also has energy reserves. Now that's significant. That's significant because if Venezuela gets aggressive, what happens in the region?
Okay.
Please note that Colombia has an election in a couple of months. Prior to this, the left-leaning candidate was making some decent ground. So that is another consideration right next to Venezuela also, because obviously Venezuela and Colombia have been kind of proxy wars with Russia and the USA. So that is another consideration there.
Good point. I saw another question here, and I'm assuming Russia continued to do business, bauxite business in the region. And I don't know if, I know when I looked at the trade, there was trade in ore, which I'm assuming was bauxite. I don't know if Dr. Hughes has any thoughts on it. I'm assuming that companies don't have to, this is not an obligation for local companies not to do business with Russia. This is something that's self-imposed, so to speak.
Yeah, well, can I make a comment on that?
Yes, please do.
We have one Russian company, UC Rosal, that owns an alumina plant, converts bauxite into alumina, which it then ships to Siberia, which is the lowest cost producer for aluminum in the world, because the energy is literally free, hydro. And so if the company is sanctioned or its principal, then it could have an impact on that plant's operation. In fact, the workers there during the week were protesting or raising issues about the likelihood of the plant being closed. I made a comment that we had a similar situation in the 1980s when Alcoa sought to close an alumina plant here, and the government acted. Despite it being a very conservative government, it decided to buy 50% of the plant and kept it open. It is still open today as Alcoa, although it is closed due to a fire recently, but it still operates as a going concern. So governments will do what governments feel they need to do to keep business going, regardless of the ideological bent. If the reality of the world requires action, then I think governments will act in that regard.
I think the important thing, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that there are no regional governments are insisting on sanctions, so to speak, for doing business with Russia. It's more of a self-imposed decision that companies are making. So is that a fair comment? Can somebody, Mariano or someone else, comment on that? Or
I was going to leave that to Ian.
Well, but Ian has had to leave, actually, so that's why I wasn't sure if anyone else. But my understanding is that this is not something that is thrust on us. It will be something that the country will make the decision as to if they wish to continue doing business with Russian companies.
The lesson of the region is that we live in the guerrilla's back door. Right. So that we always have to be careful in terms of what we do. Trinidad recently had a couple of shipments 2 years ago that passed through Trinidad that seemed to have been destined for Venezuela. It didn't, no noise was made, but there were certain conversations which were held in private. Right, so I think that there are lessons which would have already been, or signals which had already been sent.
So there might not be visible pressure. All right, we are almost at 10 minutes past 4. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to wrap up. I'd like to hand over for Kamla to do the vote of thanks. I'd like to thank the panelists, however, for the contributions. I'm happy Wesley got his mic because we were able to get some perspective. So thank you very much, the panelists. Kamla, let me hand over to you to do the wrap up now, please.